Good afternoon, or at least it is here in Northern California, where I'm joining you from. I'm Jennifer DeVere Brody, the Faculty Director here at the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you here for our annual event, Debating Race Across the Disciplines. And we'll have three guests today joining us, and then time for Q&A. And before I introduce them, I want to have a moment to thank you for coming, especially in what continues to be difficult times, but hope on the horizon. And also to thank Charles, who is doing our closed captioning. You can go to Debating Race Across the Disciplines and click on the closed caption icon at the bottom to start viewing the closed captioning. I also want to invite you at any time to put questions for the panelists in the Q&A feature, and we will have, I hope, lots of time for questions today. So our distinguished panel this year was to include Professor Stephen Roberts, but he had a teaching engagement and is unable to join us. But we are here with Sarah Dubrow, who is the assistant professor in classics. She received her PhD in classics from Yale University and was a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. Her research focuses on the literary and artistic representations of Black people in ancient Greece, and she also examines artistic renderings of Black people in Greek antiquity, focusing on the objects themselves and the museums in which they are displayed. I'll have a little bit more to say about Sarah when she begins our panel. She'll be joined by Ramon Martinez, an assistant professor in the GSE, Graduate School of Education here at Stanford. And his work explores the intersections of language, race, and ideology in public schooling experiences with students of color, with a particular focus on bi and multilingual Chicano, Latino children and youth. And then we'll have comments from Sharon Sanar, who is in the law school at Stanford, and her scholarship focuses on legal treatment of political violence, the procedural dimensions of civil rights litigation, and the role of institutions in protecting individual rights and democratic values in a national security context. So again, I'll have a little further introduction before they speak one after the other. And I want to just do two things before we have a land acknowledgement. I want to just frame the premise of this wonderful event, which is to think about the comparative nature from our different disciplinary perspectives of what we understand when we think about or use the terms race and ethnicity in our work. So as I've seen from this initial introduction, we have someone in the liberal arts and humanities, a classicist, someone in the School of Education, and someone from the law school. So from their various positionalities across the university, we'll be thinking about how does race and ethnicity, how do these matter to their scholarship and their work. So let's have a land acknowledgement, and then we'll return to the panel. Thank you. Apologies about the sound there, but this was just to acknowledge that we are here on the unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone peoples, and we are grateful and the university's dependence upon the generosity of that band. Thank you. So Now we can begin with our comments from Professor Dobro. And I wanted to just say again, she's in classics and her interests extend even to the 21st century. She's written about the reception of Greco-Roman antiquity in Africa and the African diaspora. And she's currently working on a first book, which I have had the privilege of reading parts of, and it's absolutely brilliant, entitled Untangling Blackness in Greek Antiquity, which is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. Here she uses critical race theory and performance theory to untangle ancient formulations of Blackness. And she joined our faculty officially last year after having served for 3 years as a faculty fellow in the Harvard Society of Fellows. She received her PhD from Yale in classics, and we're absolutely thrilled to have Sarah with us today. So she'll be our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Brody, for the kind introduction. And thank you to Dr. Murray for the logistics and the invitation. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? A thumbs up would be helpful to ensure that we're all on the same page. I will take it as a yes and move forward nonetheless. Thank you as well to all of you, stalwart viewers, virtual guests, whom I cannot see, but I will pose questions to all of you and hopefully get to hear from some of you during the Q&A portion. So I'd like to begin by posing a question to all of you, wherever you are. What is race before the 15th century? What is race before its modern iterations? This question has fueled my own work in terms of thinking about how to uncouple race from its presentist concerns with skin color. My interests in Blackness have fueled my work in race, but what I want to do in the next few minutes is to really tease apart the ways that I'm using race in my own work. I stand on the shoulders of people in my field, such as Denise McCoskey and Rebecca Futo-Kennedy, who are insistent on the need not only to include race in classical studies, but also to interrogate what race means, what valence it has, if we think about it as perhaps a branch from a parent tree race, so an ancient branch that is not synonymous with the modern branch, but still speaks to it in particular ways. I also am insistent on the ways that self-reflexive research is incredibly important in terms of thinking about race. I can never remove myself from the 21st century, nor can any of us remove ourselves from our historical present, but we can speak to the past in meaningful ways if we are always acknowledging that we are not authorities in terms of thinking about how a particular group or thinking about another group at one point in time, but we are rather interpreters of the material that we have access to. All of this is to say I have my own definitions of race for the purposes of antiquity that I'd like to share with you. I'll mention when I use the terms antiquity, ancient Greco-Roman world, I'm thinking about the 5th century BCE to the 4th century CE, so a span of time that is very distant from our own, but one in which the materials that I look at tend to all fall into. My definition of race most broadly for the purposes of my work is an outward-facing categorization of evaluation. That is how I view you, how you viewed me, if we were living between the time period that I mentioned. And in particular, I'm looking at literary and artistic representations. I'm making no broad claims about how people were interacting, rather how people in literature and in art were engaging and interacting with each other. There are 3 different iterations of what I am terming race that I'll be talking with you about for the next minute or so. That is race as color, race as geography, and race as attire. To begin with race as color, when I've presented my research for audiences in real time and in crowded rooms with people breathing, if we can remember those days, I've posed the question to them, what do you see on this 5th century Attic vase? This would have been used as a drinking cup for wine at drinking parties, but here we have 2 faces, both different colors. So I've asked audiences, what colors do you see? For the face on the left, I've gotten answers such as African, Black, Negroid, Ethiopian. For the face on the right, I've received comments such as white, Caucasian, European, Greek, unmarked. Each of these terms comes with its own historical, perhaps not baggage, but context. And it's something that's important whenever we identify particular objects, whenever we're thinking about how to describe particular groups. Again, this idea of race as an outward-facing category of evaluation almost becomes a performance. We're trying to understand how people are performing, and we can do this without their input. I'll move on now to race as geography. As Dr. Brody mentioned, my research looks at Black people as they're described in Greek literature and art, but they're not always described based on their skin color. They may be Black in some texts and not even mentioned in terms of their color in others. In particular, on this pelike, there's an image of Andromeda, the Ethiopian princess, according to Greek mythology, who nearly dies but is rescued by Perseus and whisked away to safety. You can see her as a central figure here, and you'll note that she is not Black. Her skin color is rather red figure, a nod to art historical language rather for thinking about iconography. Not iconography, but rather the medium of production here. So red figure as a way to describe the ways in which oxygen is being manipulated to create this vase. So here we have an Ethiopian princess. She's easily identifiable by geography and also by her clothes. Here you can see the zigzag pattern that tends to be corresponded with Persians, for example, and other Attic vase paintings. So here her race, that is her outward facing category of evaluation, the way viewers are seeing her and describing her is tied up with her geography and perhaps her attire as well. Finally, thinking about attire, I'd like to turn to a text that some of my students are reading this quarter, Aeschylus, the Suppliant Woman, which was produced in 463 BCE in Athens. This production, again, this would have been a festival with lots of people in a room, crowded, breathing on each other. If we can imagine that again in time, we'll get back there. But this production would have been quite a spectacle. And in the play, the characters, 50 Egyptian women, the Danaids, are traveling from Egypt to Greece to escape a forced marriage to their cousins. In Greece, in particular, they're in the city of Argos. They must prove to the ruler of the city, they must prove to Pelasgus that they are indeed long-lost relatives. When he first views them, he remarks in particular on their clothes. There are other features that he mentioned later on, but he's particularly curious about what they're wearing. He says, and here I read from the slide, "From what country is this company whom I address? Wearing un-Greek clothes and flaunting foreign robes and headbands. The clothes of these women are not Argive, and they are not from any place in Greece." Here we have an instance of race, the outward-facing category of evaluation, being synonymous with clothes. Taking these three all together, race as color, race as geography, and race as attire, what I hope that I've done in the few minutes that I've had with all of you is to encourage you all from whatever field you're in classics, I think there's a particular need, but in whatever field you're in, to really normalize self-reflexive approaches to social practices. This is something that critical race theorists and performance theorists have been doing for decades, and this is why I turn to them in my own work for trying to understand and grapple and uncouple race from Blackness or skin color, which is something that tends to happen more in the present day. And with these self-reflexive approaches, I believe that we can really push scholarship to expansive, inclusive heights, both in books and in the classroom. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. You've given us a great opening, and especially the question of attention to how to teach this material, these critical concepts and key words, if you will, as well as use them in our research. Thank you. I want to go back to my introduction of our second speaker, our colleague Ramon Martinez from the Graduate School of Education, where he's an assistant professor working with what we call RILE, the Race and Inequality in Language group. He also has a focus on bi and multilingual Chicano, and Latino students of color. And his research more specifically examines the everyday language and literacy of children and youth and students of color, and the way that these practices overlap with the forms of language and literacy prevailed in academic settings. So, two, he's interested in competing ideologies of language and literacy that prevail in these settings, particularly looking at the way ideologies inform language policy and classroom practices, to speak to pedagogy in urban schools, and the way that students and teachers in these schools articulate, embody, and challenge those ideologies in their everyday actions. The preparation and pre-service and schools and teachers for work in culturally and linguistic diverse learners is also a focus of his research. His articles have been published in journals such as Linguistics and Education, Research in the Teaching of English, Anthropology and Education Quarterly, Teachers College Record, and Review of Research in Education. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Martinez.
Thanks so much, Jennifer and Daniel. It's an honor and privilege to be here. Dr. Durbu and Dr. Sinar, what an honor to be part of this panel with both of you. I'll just make a few introductory remarks, and I hope you'll bear with me. This is a virtual background my 7-year-old made in Minecraft. She thought I needed something better than what I was using. So, and I don't want you to see what's behind me, but how do I define race as an educational researcher, someone in a professional school who both trains pre-service teachers, does research in classrooms, classroom-based ethnography, and someone who trains doctoral students to do research in educational settings? For me, I guess I want to start by saying that I define race increasingly. I'm coming to define race as violence, as an historical legacy of violence and hierarchy, grounded in ongoing histories of conquest, colonization, slavery, and genocide. I agree with the late Peruvian sociologist and social theorist Aníbal Quijano, who said that, quote, "The idea of race is with all certainty the most efficient instrument of social domination invented in the last 500 years," end quote. I also concur with Stanford Emerita Professor Sylvia Wynter, who said that this colonial legacy of race, the idea of race, and the global social order that it has shaped continues to profoundly distort our very understanding of what it means to be human. And I also agree with my Stanford colleague, Jonathan Rosa in the Graduate School of Education, that these distorted modes of thought, what he calls ratio-linguistic ideologies, can often directly influence how we perceive language, especially in institutional settings such as schools. And so, I take all of the above to be true. I agree with the thinkers I've mentioned above. And yet I refuse to buy into these dominant ideologies. What I attempt to do in my own research is to reimagine human learning, in particular language and literacy learning among racialized children, to reimagine it beyond the colonial logic of race. In educational research more generally, and I think we can speak to this later, it's sort of hard to discern a consensus around definitions of or perspectives on race. Education as a field is a multidisciplinary, if not interdisciplinary field. So we, in the GSE here at Stanford alone, we have folks from a range of disciplines across the humanities, social sciences, even the natural sciences. And as a result, I think there's no real single paradigm for framing or defining race. I guess one predominant paradigm is sort of a psychological orientation. Educational psychology looms large in education as a field, social science orientation in general. And this is a generalization, but I think there are folks who tend to treat race as a variable, right? And a variable that you can sort of plop into research designs, right? Sort of insert and plug into the design of a study. And one affordance of this particular employment of race, right, a reliance on racial categories, macro sociological categories, is that that this can alert us to and help us discern larger patterns of educational inequality that play out along racial lines. But I think despite the predominance of some of these social science orientations and psychological orientations in education, that there is tremendous variation, tremendous heterogeneity and diversity of perspectives and methodologies. And so I guess perhaps part of what makes my disciplinary grounding unique is that I've been trained in a field that is by definition multidisciplinary, such that there's no single educational take on race or ethnicity. Again, in my own research, I view race as a part of a colonial legacy of violence and hierarchy. I understand that the fundamental logic of racism must be traced back beyond contemporary ideas about race. And to Dr. Durbu's point about the presentist emphasis on skin color, I understand that we need to look beyond that to understand the very idea, the foundations of the very idea of race itself. And I recognize that the colonial invention of race has profoundly shaped modernity, establishing a violently dehumanizing racial hierarchy and resulting in ongoing histories of anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, and various related forms of racial violence. And I understand that the colonial logic of race continues to permeate not only the structures and institutions such as schools that are at the center of our daily lives, but also our ideas about who we are and even what it means to do things like read, write, listen, speak, and learn. So race is central to how I make sense of schooling as an institution and the practices and pedagogies that sort of pervade schools. Yet even as I perceive the pervasiveness and apparent inescapability of this colonial legacy, of the coloniality of race, I feel compelled to reject the logic of race and to seek to understand language and literacy learning beyond its grasp. So as an educational researcher, as a teacher educator, again, I teach in Stanford's teacher education program, and as a former classroom teacher myself, I feel compelled to reimagine language and literacy learning beyond the colonial logic of race, beyond what Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores call racio-linguistic modes of perception. But I believe not only that such an understanding is possible, but also that there are histories of racialized people imagining beyond coloniality, and that learning from these people and these histories can help us imagine transformative pedagogical possibilities for students of color in urban schools. And as Jennifer mentioned, my work has focused primarily on Chicanx, Latinx children and youth in urban schools. But I think the ideas that are central to my sort of conceptual foundation are relevant for racialized populations more generally. I'm increasingly interested in the experiences of Indigenous Mexican children and youth in US schools. I have an ongoing study in Los Angeles, working with an amazing group of young children who I've followed from the time they were in kindergarten to the present. They're now 10th and 11th graders in a K through 12 public school that's a sort of multi-age cohort-based dual language, Spanish-English dual language school. It's a predominantly Latinx children and youth, some Black students, some South Asian students, some East Asian students, and some East African students, primarily children of immigrants. This is a school in central Los Angeles. And part of where my current work has taken me is to focus on the lives and experiences of these kids and their families. And so that's the rationale for this sort of emergent line of inquiry on the experiences of Indigenous Mexican children, youth, and their parents, and their perspectives on multilingualism, their perspectives on what it means to maintain, sustain Indigenous languages across national borders, what it means for them to contribute to processes of sustaining and creating and redefining indigeneity in diasporic settings across racialized geographies. So I'm increasingly interested in the notion of racialized geography as sort of a way of thinking about how Indigenous Mexican migrants are positioned and framed in Mexico, as well as here in the United States, particularly in classroom settings. So that's a little bit about me and the work that I do. Again, I'm in a professional school, and a big part of my work is focused very practically on preparing teachers to work in urban schools where they'll come into contact with racialized students. So I look forward to continuing this conversation. I'll stop there to leave room for other folks to chime in. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those wonderful comments. And again, I think we're going to have lots to discuss about these various variables and the ways in which we understand both race historically in the present and how it forms our research. So I'm it's exactly the radical heterogeneity of how we might perceive the terms that gives rise to this panel, but I think also what we need to interrogate in thinking about these questions of hierarchy, coloniality, and power. With that, I will introduce our third and final speaker, and then the panel will open up for questions. I want to remind you to use the Q&A function for any questions you might have for the panelists. Now, last but not least, we're joined by Professor Shirin Sinar from the law school. She's been here since 2012 as a professor, although she was a student here. Her scholarship focuses on the legal treatment of political violence, the procedural dimensions of civil rights litigation, and the role of institutions in protecting individual rights and democratic values in the national security context. Her recent work is looking at the legal regime for domestic and international terrorism under US law. And she's also written about the capacity of executive agencies, such as inspectors generals and civil rights offices, to monitor and oversee national security conduct. Her articles have been published widely in California Law Review, Georgetown Law Review, Harvard and Michigan Law Reviews, Stanford Law Reviews, and elsewhere. In 2017, she was the co-recipient of the inaugural Mike Lewis Prize for National Security Scholarship for an article she did entitled The Lost Story of Iqbal. She also teaches courses in civil procedure, advanced terrorism, and intersections of race and identity with national security. And I think it's wonderful that she was given the John Bingham Hurlburt Award for Excellence in Teaching. That was nominated by the graduating class in 2016. She's also been a Thomas Gray Fellow, where for 5 years she represented individuals facing discrimination based on government, national security policies, and unlawful employment practices, which she did first as an Equal Justice Works Fellow at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights in San Francisco, and then as a staff attorney with the Asian Law Caucus. Finally, she clerked for Warren Ferguson, who's on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So please welcome Professor Sinar.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brody, and the whole panel and the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity for putting together the event. So Dr. Brody has offered actually a detailed introduction to my work. So what I'll do is just say a little about my current research and how race plays into my fields of study. And then I'll close with a few thoughts on how I define race within law. So I study essentially two fields, national security law, and within that particularly the legal treatment of political violence. And then I also study civil procedure, which is a field about the rules that affect how you can enforce your rights in court or whether you can do so at all. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of that the work on political violence, some of my recent research has been on how the legal structure for terrorism law essentially is bifurcated between domestic and international terrorism. And essentially that legal structure has evolved in this bifurcated fashion to deal separately according to the identity and ideology behind perceived threats of political violence. Some of my other recent work has been on hate crimes laws. Actually, the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity sponsored a convening that I put together last year between civil rights groups, hate crimes experts, and others on revisiting hate crimes laws and whether the model of enhancing punishment for individuals convicted of hate crimes is consistent with an overall racial justice perspective. So that's just to give you a little bit of a sense of the work that I do. In terms of how race plays into this, in the fields in which I write, so national security law on the one hand, civil procedure on the other, race is largely absent. And that's changing. We see a lot more people now doing critical work within those fields, and that critical scholarship centers race and identity much more profoundly than the fields had previously. But these are fairly new developments, and it's still a minority approach to teaching law, to writing about law in those fields. And so I'll just take national security law as an example. There has been a handful of academics within law schools addressing race, especially as applied to Muslims, South Asians, folks of Middle Eastern origin, and others who are racialized as a category after 9/11 and subject to the brunt of national security and counterterrorism policies. So that there's been some scholarship along those lines for a number of years, but even that scholarship has often been somewhat marginal within a field that has much more often operated according to a spectrum between more civil libertarian approaches and more kind of aggressive law enforcement or government approaches. But even along that spectrum, you didn't typically get a lot of critical perspective on national security or counterterrorism or perspectives that engaged race. And this absence was so striking that finally, it seems like just as of this past summer, when we had a nationwide conversation on race and connection with police protests, there's been a sudden outpouring within national security law of interest in the intersection between race and national security. Previously, the reaction was often, well, what does race have to do with national security? And for some of you in other fields, that actually may be surprising. So disciplines like sociology or anthropology and other disciplines in the humanities find very close connections between such concepts as national security and race. Yet in law, the idea had often been that national security as an idea transcends race. That the nation to be protected is a nation of all of us, and so that race or other groupings of identity that might matter in a domestic political context or legal context are just simply not relevant when it comes to a more outward-looking national security field. So that's long been a problem within the field of national security law, and we see that dynamic changing, but only as a fairly recent development. So I will just close with a couple of thoughts on how I define race. And so within law, the field of critical race theory since the 1980s has been exploring, debating, writing about, the meaning of race, the impact of race. And there's actually a large scholarship in critical race theory. It's just that it doesn't necessarily affect how other fields within legal scholarship think about or address race. But one particular definition of race that I've found compelling from some of that work comes from Ian Haney-Lopez, who's a constitutional law scholar and critical race theorist at Berkeley. And he defined race as the historically contingent social systems of meaning that attach to elements of morphology and ancestry. And the key point here is that, in line with many other theorists, he views race as a social construction, not a matter of biology or morphology or ancestry on its own, but it's about historically contingent systems of meaning that attach to those sorts of physical characteristics. And one of the other insights that he and others within CRT have really advanced is the understanding that law has an important role in constructing race. So it's not that law is just responding to pre-existing racial categories, but it's actually defining the content of racial identities and the privilege or disadvantage that different groups have. Again, I'll quote Haney-Lopez, but in his words, law constructs race both through coercion and ideology. So coercion in the sense that when law imposes rules, those rules affect the material conditions of different groups of people. And law constructs race also through ideology. In other words, by transmitting ideas about the social status to be accorded different groups. And I found that reference point really helpful to thinking about, for example, how terrorism law or national security law likewise is influential in constructing race as a matter both of coercion and ideology. So I will end there.
Thank you so much for those wonderful comments and bringing in so much of critical race theory and giving us a sense of how also, I think, for some, a radical idea of the way in which law does shape race, even beyond things like the role of hypodescent in 1/32, or the way they defined whiteness through cases throughout the US, for example. But understanding that, it reminds me a little bit of our wonderful Chautauqua in the Fall with Matt Clare, and the ways in which he was also looking at race as a product in some sense, in terms of how privilege and punishment were meted out in the Boston area where he was doing his research. So some through lines. I want to invite everyone, please, to ask questions in the Q&A. I might ask one to get us started, and maybe I'd like to bring the panel back on so that they might even ask questions of one another. So I think today, in our very brief but substantive presentations, we've talked a little bit about race as color, as geography, as something that is not necessarily biological, but tied to ideas of ancestry, a way of constructing difference, power, its origins in colonial and geographic conflict, but all of those questions of these global connections and disconnections, and the way in which we, to quote another critical legal scholar, Patricia Ward Williams, thinking through these categories. And it's not necessarily the categories that are the sin, but rather how, where, and I would add why, right? In whose vested interests might we continue with these differences, right? So we have categories not only abstractly of race, or we haven't mentioned ethnicity, and I think that's another question that's happened over the years on these panels. What happens to that? Where do we draw that line? But also as a linguistic issue, again, tied to geography, but I think difference might be the overall arching question. And so that idea of how do we think about differences that we might label as race. And I also want to point out that a number of you talked about racialization, and it might be helpful for the audience to parse those two different terms as whether is it something, a noun, or a process, a verb, in which one becomes racialized, right? So all of these really difficult questions, theoretically, that nevertheless have real material consequences. And I think that's also something that each of you gestured towards, if not named explicitly, right? That these categories of difference matter because they literally are putting us in positions of life or death or status. Yeah. So maybe I'll ask each of you if you have questions for one another. Just about these terms.
I'd love to ask Dr. Derbu a question. I found each of your presentations fascinating, and as you talked about race in these three forms: race as skin color, race as geography, and race as attire, one question that occurred to me is, given that race meant something different or could be seen in different dimensions, I guess one question might be, why call it race, or what connects it in your mind to race as we have come to understand it today? I wonder if some might say, well, is that a category that existed at all in your time period? So I'm curious about how you draw the connection between those older understandings and the concept that many of us use in a more contemporary context.
Thank you for your question, Dr. Sinar. It's intentionally provocative, and part of what I want to do in my work is to really push both those in my field and those outside to think about how you are not somehow free from having to deal with the complications of categorization today merely because you're studying a time period in the past. So I use it almost to encourage those in my field, those reading material in my field, to really have to grapple with, what does it mean when I hear the word race and think Black? Or what does it mean if I hear the word race and think inferior? And how am I using that or leaning on that in my teachings or in my daily practices? So I do agree with you that it's a term that perhaps we could use another word for, but I really want to integrate it into my work as a way to make, maybe not discomfort, but to make a jarring sense of reality a part of the educational experience, because there is something that I think readers can take away if they do read the word. I also know that because my introduction into my field, or professionally into the field, has been thinking about Black people, I've really been grappling with how to include Blackness in a way that does not mirror the present day. And I felt that trying to use this word race and rehabilitate it was a useful way to both recognize that Blackness meant something in antiquity, but to also show that it didn't mean what we would traditionally think that it means today. So we cannot transpose it into the past, and we cannot transpose race in a similar way. So maybe they're, if we want to use a metaphor of a ship, they're both in the boat traveling to the past, but they're both changing in different ways, but I think they're in dialogue with each other. I would like to pose a question in return, if I can, Dr. Brody.
Of course, yes. I want the panelists to talk for you all to talk amongst yourself for a moment. Yes.
My question, Dr. Sinar, is you were talking a lot about national security, and when you started talking about critical race theory, I wondered about the broader applicability outside of America, because of the ways that you mentioned race kind of being constructed, or the legal field constructing race. And I wonder, how does that translate? You mentioned in the Middle East or in other countries that perhaps have a majority that is not white. In what ways does race play out in the legal practices in those countries? This is very broad, so whatever you can do with this question, I'd appreciate.
Well, I will take a stab at it. And first, I have to disclaim a credential I don't have. So I'm not Dr. Sinar. In law, many people come from an experience of law practice. I came from a civil rights law background. So I just don't want to affirm a credential I don't have. All right. When it comes to the question of race internationally, one of the things that is interesting is that there's been a recent development to try to bring critical race theory in conversation with international law. And that attempt, it's actually been made over a period of some 20 years. So there was a convening, I understand, some 20 years ago when people attempted to bring these conversations together. And then there have been some much more recent efforts in the last year or so to do the same thing. And one of the questions that always arises in that context is the extent to which American conceptions of race, the work that race might do in a US context, does that translate over to other contexts? And my understanding of kind of the response to that question, although I've not been myself deeply engaged with these discussions, is that there's a sense of both similarities and differences. So in any national context, it may be that a society is bifurcated or divided in some other kind of hierarchy that is not as based on skin color, for example. But if we think of race as, in broader terms, as social meaning assigned to different categories, then there's always some system of creating a hierarchy according to characteristics. And so whether it is as focused on skin color as it might be in the US context, or if it attaches to other kinds of categories, ethnicity, for example, categories more based on language or culture or, origin that don't necessarily relate as much to what we think of as race in the US context, every society has some system of hierarchy. And sometimes in that conversation on international law and critical race studies, I've heard a number of people kind of warn against too easily transferring over the categories that are most meaningful in the US context. So for example, not to assume that race is doing the exact same work abroad, but also to recognize that with colonialism, I mean, it's no accident that what was considered the developing or the third world, is a world of largely non-white peoples who experience a particular relationship with the United States or European colonial power. So there's certainly parallels. Race retains its importance, but perhaps the categories that are applicable in other contexts shouldn't just be thought to replicate exactly what we see in the US.
Ramon, do you want to add something?
Yeah, and I have probably multiple questions for both of you, but maybe I'll circle back to Dr. Derbu. I'm fascinated by the way in which your work disrupts what you call the presentist focus on skin color. I love that phrasing. How do you think your work can inform present-day discussions of race and definitions of race, particularly with respect to contemporary artistic and maybe pop culture representations of racial categories?
Thank you, Dr. Martinez. My hope is that my work can speak to modern audiences in terms of really unpacking the ways in which race is used. So the shorthand of race equaling only Blackness or race equaling only some sort of unequal paradigm, I think it begs for a bit more interrogation. I'm really drawn to a lot of work in critical race theory in terms I'm thinking of Barbara Field's and Karen Field's idea of racecraft and the ways in which there are parallels with witchcraft in terms of races being both unseen and seen, tangible and intangible, but also recognizing that the relationship between racism and race is one that we don't always talk about, but is absolutely tied together in the modern context. So if we want to think about, for example, driving while Black or napping while Black or all of those iterations, we really tend to erase the actor on that stage and focus only on the subject. So I do think that with critical race theory and with a very specific kind of laser eye specificity, looking at language, you can bring the two together and really highlight what's going on in a more horizontal way, rather than insisting on continuing to step on particular groups of people in order to have an easier way of dealing with contentious categories.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Do you want to say a little bit, Ramon, about how you think of making these changes? You were saying we all understand the latent and contemporary ways in which racial identity is constitutive through violence, through these violent histories that, affect our lives on a daily basis. But the ways you were trying to talk about resistance, right, to changing some of that, which I think had to do with a revaluation of language. And I noticed you were talking about your particular cohort you were working with through LA. But do they also know Indigenous languages? And can you talk a little bit about the hierarchy there, which I think speaks to across all three presentations?
Sure. I'll try to be very brief. Thanks for the question, Dr. Brody. Like I said, I've known this group of children. I've had the privilege of working with a group of kids, and I know them now because I've been with them since kindergarten. They're now 10th and 11th graders in high school, same school, a public school in central Los Angeles. And there's a subgroup of students who are of Indigenous Mexican ancestry, mostly of Zapotec ancestry. So they're Zapoteco, right? And they speak an Indigenous language that's called Zapoteco or Zapotec. Not to get too much into the weeds here, but Indigenous Mexican languages are often pejoratively, they're denigrated and pejoratively dismissed as mere dialect, right? Oh, ese no es idioma, es dialecto, right? That's not a language, it's a dialect, right? When you have linguists who devote their lives to studying these languages and call them languages and talk about how they're connected to and related to larger language families. But in contemporary mainstream Mexican society, the dominant discourse around Indigenous languages is at their dialect, right? And so that's a sort of framing that exists in Mexico. What I'm particularly interested in is what happens when indigenous Mexican people come to the United States, and what experiences do they have with the education system here? And what I found, and I think what some of the scholarship has documented, although I should say that this is a group that has largely been erased from the scholarship and sort of invisibilized in the scholarship, and also in the public discourse around Mexican immigrants, right? Oftentimes, it's a growing population, right? Indigenous Mexican children in US schools, but they're oftentimes racialized as Latinx, right? As brown, and imagined to be only bilingual, right? Only bilingual. And the kids that I've worked with are at least trilingual. These are multilingual kids. And yeah, and some of them do indeed speak their heritage languages with parents to varying degrees, right? And they have lots of different sorts of feelings about what it means to be or become multilingual, to be indigenous, to affiliate with a particular hometown, right? Or indigenous group. And I've spent some time, not as much time working with parents, mostly it's with the children themselves, but I've spent some time interviewing mothers in particular of indigenous children, Mexican children in US schools, about their perspectives on what it means to maintain indigenous language in their kids' lives. And it's fascinating to me, you know, to think about how people can migrate here to across national borders, and how they think about themselves in their home country versus here, and what it means to reproduce and to transform indigeneity in diasporic settings has become more of a focus of my work. So yeah, I think for sure, how indigenous Mexican children think about themselves, their language practices, everyday language practices, if you will, and their attendant language ideologies have become a central focus of my more recent work. Maybe I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also a key issue is linguistics and the languages we speak that bespeak us in many ways in terms of nationality, race, and ethnicity. I have a question from the audience, which is asking, I think, for a little bit of elaboration on what you were just speaking about, Ramon, which is what are some of the indicators that young children who pick up on these hierarchy of languages perceive from adults that the children notice, and that their influence of the language acquisition of Spanish, indigenous languages, etc. So how do you, what were some of the indicators that you had about that, or that they may have mentioned?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, part of it is this framing of indigenous languages as simply dialects, right? And it's sort of shorthand for indigenous languages in Mexico to say dialect, and different people mean different things when they say that. But I think that sort of framing, that discursive framing, that sometimes you know, immigrants bring with them to this country is part of the sort of milieu in which these children are being socialized in and through language, right? But I think it's the erasure, right? Their erasure as a population, as a subgroup, right? And the erasure of indigenous languages. I mean, what's interesting to me is that I'm working with these kids in a dual language school where Spanish is very much privileged, or at least there's an institutional attempt to privilege Spanish almost as much as English in this setting, right? So Spanish language and literacy skills are cultivated. A lot of these kids are encouraged to pursue the California State Seal of Biliteracy, right? They're taking AP Spanish classes and then moving on and taking additional language classes beyond that. So Spanish, you know, to a certain degree, is in good shape at this school. But the indigenous Mexican languages are not often recognized. Some teachers are surprised to learn that their students are multilingual, that they speak additional languages beyond just Spanish. So the idea that kids are imagined to be only Latinx, right, only bilingual, I think is reflective of this sort of broader perception of who these people are. When they immigrate to this country, they're encouraged in lots of different ways to sort of blend into the existing racial geography, to the existing racial logic, right? So they're imagined to not be indigenous in a sense, right? And what I think is so fascinating is how these children and their parents sort of defy that, right? They're in a sense defying and disrupting the myth of indigenous extinction, right? By continuing to speak their heritage languages, by continuing to pass those languages on to their kids. So I'm talking in circles maybe, and maybe not totally
No, I mean, and
addressing
I
the
just
question.
would put that in the context of, what happened in schools where, Indigenous languages were not allowed to be spoken, maybe even the English only movement, again, about defining race and nation, or thinking about the ways in which historically at Oxbridge, or the language of scholarship was Greek and Latin. So that I think each of us enter in, and I'd be curious also to think about tests around immigration and, citizenship that also depend upon, right, our ability to, speak the master's language, if you will, or I always think about the old joke, what determines the standard versus the dialect, who had the bigger army? Right. So again, we're back to those questions of violence and power that determine it's not, it's arbitrary in one sense, right? But that we are all beholden in some sense, right, to the accidents of where we are born and how we then have access to, right, certain kinds of codes and languages. I said that in some sense we speak them, but they also speak us. Yeah, I don't know if that's anyone else wants to say something on language. And I think we have Jody in the audience has a hand raised for a question. I don't know if I have the ability to turn to the audience, so I'm going to ask again if you can put your questions in the chat. Oh, wonderful. There was a question for Sarah. What would you say the classical example that best serves Black people and other subaltern racial identities by utilizing notable examples outside Greco-Roman range? So Andromeda, Dionysus, and others that form the foundation for historical and current Afro identity, or by using marginalized figures of the past. So I think the question is sort of saying, are there other places and peoples in Iberia, Gaul, Egypt, other territories in dialogue with modern populations that are endeavoring to build decolonialized identities? It's a very long question. So what might be a path for remaking classics? And could we think about that as potential future scholars?
Thank you. And thank you for your question, Samuel. It's very full, and I'll do my best to address it in the ways that I can. What I'm taking away from your question is, how can we move away from having exempla? And we do this in the 21st century as well. We have Obama, we have Kamala Harris, therefore there's no more racism in America. Or in antiquity, we have Memnon, we have Andromeda, therefore all Black people in antiquity were somehow related to royal lineage. But I do find it useful to turn to some of Frank Snowden Jr.'s work. So in his lexicon of iconography of the mythological world, he gives a wonderful compendium, rather a list of different types of roles that Black people played in literature and art. He includes archers. They were renowned for, Nubians in particular, were renowned for their ability to really shoot the bow and arrow, to string the bow and arrow in ways that help them gain renown beyond their country. They're also very religiously well-known, i.e. they worship Isis, they worship both Greek gods and Nubian gods as well. They are really talented in terms of performances as well. Some of them are enslaved and some of them serve in the bathhouses. There are mosaics from Pompeii that have people who have Black skin as bath attendants. But what I find most important is to really show students and to show people in the field and outside of the field of classics that Black people did so much more than only serve as enslaved people or only serve as royal people. And in this way, it can really push people to think about antiquity as having a very different kind of cultural stratagem for categorizing people. Not 100% different from the present day, but very much in its own context. When I think of the etymology of the word slave and Slav and thinking about Eastern Europe, it's curious that the etymology of the word doesn't have anything to do with Blackness, but for presentist reasons, we tend to conflate it with Blackness in the 21st century. So whenever I talk about Black people in Greek antiquity as they're represented in literature, and again, we're getting representations and not their own voices, but they do tend to show up in a number of roles. And I think that putting Memnon next to other iterations of Black people is a helpful way to ensure that both the field and both people who are engaging with the field in whatever way are able to get a more holistic feature, a holistic rather representation until we get the translation of Meroitic scripts, until we get more sources from the Nile Valley where people who have Black skin are able to speak for themselves and let people know how they were categorizing each other.
Thank you. That makes me think a little bit about how maybe each of you could speak to the ways in which your field addresses our current moment. I know Sharon was writing recently about questions of terrorism and cautions with the implementation of those laws, right, which again are not always distributed as similarly across different bodies. And maybe just to think a little bit, I know part of your mission, Sarah, is to rethink how we understand the classics, as your last question just explained. And I think, Ramon, you're also interested in, as we all are, because it's not just the study of race for some kind of abstract reason per se, but also because we know it has real effects, if you will, or material changes, even right on what does a classics professor look like, these kinds of questions. So maybe we'll just open it up and talk a little bit about how maybe your discipline or you or your work are thinking through the implications for the moment we find ourselves in now.
So I'd be happy to say something about very near-term events, which is the invasion of the Capitol and a lot of both the language and the legal responses that have been proposed in response to that. And over the last few weeks, there was a question both about how do we talk about what happened? Was it an insurrection? Was it a self-coup? Was it a seditious conspiracy? Was it terrorism? And a simultaneous conversation about the types of legal and state responses that ought to be deployed to deal with the issue. And one of the things that I've been writing about recently, actually before this incident, but this incident brings it up again, is the need for real caution when embracing the terrorism or counterterrorism frame for dealing with threats like violence by white supremacists or others on the far right. And we tend to have very short-term perspective sometimes in thinking about incidents. So there's a lot of media commentary sort of urging the most expansive, severe legal response possible to those who invaded the Capitol. There were people calling for seditious conspiracy charges to be used, for instance, against protesters. So not just there's a whole bevy of law enforcement charges that can be brought against somebody who, say, assaulted a guard at the Capitol or trespassed in the building. But saying that no, we should term this seditious conspiracy. We should term this terrorism and elevate our treatment. And we so often kind of forget the longer-term perspective, which is charges like those sorts of frameworks are typically used much more seriously and expansively against people who are part of subordinated communities or who are challenging in some way the dominant racial or socioeconomic order. So it was just a few months back that the Attorney General was talking about using seditious conspiracy charges against police protesters. And there were rightful objections that you don't need to ratchet up that sort of response. Even when there is violence, it doesn't mean that you employ the most escalated framework or stigma that you can. But yet, when it comes to an incident like this, that sometimes tends to be the instinctive response. So my work has focused on how expanding the counterterrorism framework even when the idea is that somehow that will equalize treatment across groups, it'll mean that we'll treat white supremacists more seriously than we have in the past, that there's that call for expansion is problematic.
Thank you. Other speakers?
I'm thinking about your question, Dr. Brody, about pushing ourselves to see what our fields can do or what needs to be done in order to really integrate race in a responsible way. And I remember being a graduate student walking in the hallways, seeing an advertisement for a course about Nubia, and I needed to fulfill a history requirement. So I took it, and as I learned, I was stunned that I had never really had a chance to focus on this region of the world before in this time period, in a time period that is not slavery, in a pre-colonial Africa. So that would be my push for any classics department, for my own at Stanford and for the ones around the country and the world, to really think about ways to include ancient Africa beyond Egypt, because as important as Egypt is, because of the unfortunate whitewashing that tends to happen in the modern day, we're not always pushing students to think about Egypt and Nubia in dialogue with each other, as opposed to Egypt and Greece, which has become more of the norm.
Ramon?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things right now, right, that would be timely, I think, to focus on. Just within the last day, you know, the Biden administration's executive orders on immigration reform. You know, I think they can give us reason to be hopeful, but I think there's going to still be a need to explore the educational experiences of undocumented, deported, returned students and their experiences, unaccompanied children in this country and their experiences in education and related to education. So I am hopeful, but at the same time, I think there's going to be a just as great a need to explore the experiences of those students. And I guess related to that, to this sort of, you know, I guess what Michael Eric Dyson calls the perverse predictability of anti-Black violence. I think, you know, there's sort of a moment of reckoning in the Latinx community, quote unquote, to use that phrase, to reckon with anti-Blackness in the Latinx community on the one hand, and on the other hand, to recognize emergent forms of solidarity, of Black Latinx solidarity between and among Black folks in the Latinx community and non-Black folks in the Latinx community. And I think what I'm encouraged by is what I see happening at the grassroots level in communities, emergent forms of solidarity. And I think we would do well to learn more about what's going on as we try to theorize and understand better what's happening on the ground.
That leads me nicely into another question, which is having to do with, we had started out talking a little bit about pedagogy, curriculum, our spaces across the university, but we are also, of course, held in this university in particular ways of organizing knowledge that are absolutely hierarchical, right? We don't teach a lot of Indigenous languages, depending on how you define Indigenous, I understand that, as well as the fact, right, that we don't always have a chance to talk to one another in spaces like this. And when you're talking about activism, you know, where we learn, where we think knowledge happens, the idea of, you know, not just professors or teachers hold all the knowledge of how we can organize things and become a better community, world community. But I wanted to then ask a little bit, not only about what kind of learning in that way, but I'm forgetting my question here. Critical race studies is something that each of you mentioned as a kind of knowledge base, which is not that old. I've been teaching long enough to remember when, you know, there was that first volume of critical race studies and the meetings. And it was an interracial group of scholars, but legal scholars. And of course, that was recently caused a controversy because it was called out for something that was about sort of indoctrination or somehow not a legitimate form of study that affects, I think, all of us who are broadly conceived as race scholars. So since each of you mentioned critical race studies in your presentations, and it's been, you know, was something of controversy recently, again, about what we should teach and how, maybe can you just say a little bit about why you think it's important or useful? I know, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. And it was also something, of course, that went well beyond law. Like Kimberly Crenshaw's work on Black feminist theory and intersectionality, and so many of the other people involved.
I'm happy to begin that. I want to go back 2 comments to mention that when I spoke of Kamala Harris, I meant to say Vice President Kamala Harris. So my apologies. But to your question, Dr. Brody, you mentioned Kimberly Crenshaw, and as much as intersectionality has become perhaps mainstream in ways that I think is very positive, but I know there's been pushback, there is a richness in terms of thinking of the ways, at least for her, Blackness and gender as women were working in concert as opposed to in isolation. And that is very important, moving that into different spaces and morphing it for different people's own ends is another conversation, but I found it useful for thinking about, for example, the characters that I mentioned on the final slide that I had, these Egyptian women in the Suppliant Woman in one Greek play. They are women, but they're also Egyptian. They also wear foreign clothes. They also have Black skin. They also are not always with their father and start becoming leaders in their own right. So I find intersectionality useful there as a way to theorize the different categories that they're fitting into, and each one further entrenches them into this category of other, but they eventually make other become the same. So no category is fixed in continuity. In addition, when I think of the character Pelasgus, the king who is receiving them and is forced to eventually accept them into the city, I use Derek Bell's concept of interest convergence, which he used after the Brown versus Board of Ed ruling in 1954, where he says that, this was not, desegregation of schools was not due to the sudden desire of the white populace to include Black people, but it was because there were returning Black veterans who were coming in and shaking up the economic systems and educational systems in America, because it was no longer good for America's PR campaign to have such segregated schools in America. And so I use interest convergence, very much recognizing Derek Bell's context, and I move it into the context of this mythical Argos. And I argue that this King Pelasgus is very interested in not having his city fall apart. So he's not suddenly attached to these women who have claimed that they are related to him based on their great-great-great-great-grandmother. He's not suddenly sympathetic to the plight of women on their own, but he's afraid that they will pollute his city with suicide if he does not accept them. So interest convergence is what pushes him to really think about this being a threat to his city and him needing to protect it, both protect the face of his city and his own reputation. So critical race theory, rather than only foregrounding skin color, really unpacks categories that we don't always think about as being worthy of untangling. And those are ways that I find it really useful for my own work.
Thank you. Other folks?
I could add a little bit to that. Just on interest convergence, I have to say that as a practicing civil rights lawyer, so before I started teaching law, we grappled with ideas about interest convergence and how to deploy that all the time, because sometimes our instinct as people working with and on behalf of clients and subordinated communities would be to make a principled argument for why they should not be subject to some form of injustice. Yet we knew, especially when we were working on civil rights issues in the national security context, where for the longest time no one really thought that much of the needs of communities that were on the receiving end of national security policy. We often struggled with, well, should we additionally make an argument about how it would be better for security or public safety if some policy were changed in a direction which also benefited communities? And they were often challenging questions, because the argument that might have been rhetorically successful may not have been one that centered the interests and needs of the communities. Yet, if you wanted to get some strategic change on their behalf, sometimes those sorts of arguments would work in public discourse in a different way. So that's just a point on how it presents real life dilemmas for advocates in the political context. Just one quick point that actually relates to Dr. Brody's question earlier about processes of racialization. I thought I would just mention one quick example from the area of national security law, and it ties in also to how critical race theory has informed my own work. So the idea that law matters in processes of racialization. One example of that happened shortly after, or in the couple of years after September 11th, when government policy, government profiling policy, as well as private acts of hate crimes and violence, stitched together communities that had been disparate in terms of how they identified themselves. So in the years after 9/11, there was a process of racializing a category that united people who are Muslim, South Asian, Middle Eastern, or mistakenly perceived to be any of those categories. And so you had a whole new racial category emerge because of, in part because of law and the way that they were treated by legal profiling programs, and also by acts of violence that didn't distinguish between a person who was South Asian Muslim and somebody who was, Latino, but looked to the onlooker as someone who might have been Muslim or Middle Eastern. So that's part of also what I draw from critical race theory, is the understanding that law and legal policies shape larger processes of racialization.
Thank you. That's so helpful and really important. I think I glossed over that a little bit when I was talking about the rule of hypodescent, that if you're of 1/32nd, degree or any idea of Black blood, you are Black in this country, as am I, because I was born before 1967, and when the anti-miscegenation laws were ended in the United States. So again, these kinds of things are absolutely mediated by law, but also by other kinds of issues. Thank you. Ramon?
Yeah, I noticed we're near time. Just very briefly,
Yes.
I'll say that, I think critical race theory has been tremendously influential in the field of education. I want to say that, educational researchers were relatively early adopters of CRT outside of law, outside of the legal field. Gloria Ladson-Billings had a piece in 1998. It was titled something like just what is critical race theory and what is it doing in a nice field like education. So I think it's been drawn on by lots of critically oriented scholars of color in educational research. In my own work, I've drawn on the notion recently on the notion of microaggressions as a way of examining how racialized students get perceived by teachers, and how this how this shapes the opportunities that teachers make available to students, the opportunities that they withhold from students. I've also drawn on the notion of counter narratives to explore how Chicanx and Latinx children interrogate and contest dominant racial narratives and racist framings of them and their communities. So I think it's been influential, in the field and in my own work for sure.
Thank you so much. I want to remind the audience that's here to fill out a survey and just maybe ask if there are any last questions. This has been more rich than we've been able to cover, and I sort of want to go back and watch every year's and think through this more. But I'm at the very least happy to have a conversation across and through our own different locations and racial formations and specific moments in the academy too. So are there anything else you want to bring up that we should cover? Okay, well, we can conclude. I don't see any last questions in the chat, but I want to thank again each of you for taking time to be here. And I look forward not only to next year's, but I hope we've also made some connections across the schools that we don't always often have the opportunity to do. So thank you all very, very much, and stay well.
Thank you.
Thanks
you
to all the staff at CCSRE for the hard work you put into bringing this to everyone here. We'll have also a recording up on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, following the finalization of the closed captioning. And again, thank you, Charles, for doing that for us.